We operated under these principles. We believed in the strategic precision bombing of key targets deep in the enemy's territory, such as airplane factories, aluminum plants, and submarine building bases.
A few minutes later.
Targets. Secondary. Blah blah blah. In case of poor visibility, bomb center of town.
No, 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 no.
Hi everyone, Woe Kelly here. Tell me if you've heard this one. During World War II, the American 8th Army Air Force in England carried out a precision bombing campaign that targeted German military and industrial targets and avoided deliberately targeting German civilians. If you're a student of the air war over Europe, you have probably heard this or some kind of similar truism that portrays the American bombing campaign against Germany as a largely military bombing campaign that shunned the deliberate targeting of German civilians or the bombing of German cities. I mean, it's what all the movies and books say.
There's only one hope of shortening this war. Daylight precision bombing. We could lose the war if we don't knock out German industry.
Braving ferocious German defenses and hitting strategic targets with unparalleled precision.
We're lead plane now. I'm gonna do my best to get the bombs right in the pickle barrel and get us out of here safe.
But is that true? No, it is not. Despite claims during and after the war by American Air Force commanders that American bombers did not deliberately target German cities, they did. And American commanders and crews knew it. In fact, right from the very first raid on Germany, American bombers carried out area-style attacks on German towns and cities. Yet 80 years after the war, such an assertion would be surprising to many, and highlights the successful efforts of American Air Force commanders to mold the way the public came to view the bombing effort against Germany. For a multitude of reasons, American leaders made conscious efforts to hide this aspect of their bombing campaign against Germany, both during and after the war, unlike some other commanders.
Would you do anything differently?
If I had the same time over again, I would do the same thing.
Arthur fire after Lancaster's Harris. Arthur clubbing Sea Lion Harris. Arthur historic site. Set a delight Harris.
This is the first video in a series of relatively short videos where I will aim to cover the evolution of American city bombing policy and how it evolved from a last resort type attack during initial raids into Germany into a key part of the overall American bombing effort against Germany. In his frequent discussions with General Spaatz and other air officers, General Eisenhower is finding that daylight bombing, the efficacy of which we are now undertaking to demonstrate in growing strength, has developed only one real weakness, and that is the necessity of good weather. So why did American bombers bomb German cities in World War II? Well, very simply, pre-war theories ran into the brick wall of operational realities. In fact, the American experience of daylight bombing in many ways mirrored the Royal Air Force's own experience. However, whereas the Royal Air Force's journey towards city bombing began with their daylight bombers being savaged by German fighters, forcing a switch to inaccurate nighttime bombing, the American experience began with the realization that their Norden bombsight, for all its accuracy, was largely useless the majority of days American bombers could fly on.
Slaps top of Norden bombsight. This bad boy can fit so much disappointment in it.
A study of the weather by the 8th Air Force's Operational Analysis Section in January 1943 laid bare the reality. Studies covering the last 8 years showed that throughout the year, an average of less than 6 days per month, which will be suitable for high-level visual bombing of typical European targets, are to be anticipated. And that during the winter months from November to February inclusive, the expectation for suitable weather averages between 2 and 3 days per month. Compounding the lack of days suitable for precision bombing was the difficulty in accurately predicting when these suitable days would actually occur. You see, predicting the weather in the 1940s was, well, something of a challenge. As Arthur Harris,
Arthur got a shelter, here comes the melter Harris. Arthur British kite sets dressed in a light Harris. Arthur
Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, recorded in his post-war dispatches, The general meteorological conditions favorable to clear skies are also favorable to the development of a broken or continuous layer of stratocumulus cloud, and the necessary detailed information to enable the forecaster to distinguish the two cases was often not available. As a result, American bombers would be sent out on bombing raids when good weather was expected, only to find thick cloud blanketing the aiming point. And the opposite was true. Days when suitable weather for daylight precision bombing raids would be missed because bad weather was inaccurately forecasted over the target area. These weather issues all came to a head quickly in the fall and winter of 1942, when a large proportion of planned 8th Air Force raids against targets were cancelled or aborted due to poor weather conditions. Of the 11 planned missions in October 1942, just 3 were flown to completion. November saw 7 missions flown, a better turnout, but December saw only 4 missions flown. Just 3 months into the American daylight bombing effort, and the weather was proving so troublesome that calls were already emerging from within the United States Army Air Force to abandon daylight raids and join the Royal Air Force night bombing effort. After all, accuracy was not quite as important on those raids. Generals Karl Spaatz and Ira Eaker of the 8th Air Force were still convinced of the efficiency of daylight bombing raids over night attacks, and were not willing to abandon daylight bombing at this early juncture, but desperation was setting in. With the loss of several of the most experienced bomber groups to join the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the stakes were high. The future of the 8th Air Force rested largely on the outcome of operations during the next few months. Millions of dollars and man-hours were expended in putting a bomber force in the air. 8th Bomber Command had to justify such expenditure and effort. If the B-17s and B-24s showed signs of succeeding at their task, their numbers would be increased tenfold. If they failed, the American heavy bombers would in all probability be relegated to tactical missions at a later stage. The fate of the 8th Air Force was in the balance. Desperate times called for desperate measures. Imagine you're an American Air Force commander. You have hundreds of big, 4-engine bombers, armed to the teeth with heavy caliber machine guns, which are meant to fly in large, self-defending formations through enemy airspace to deliver concentrated precision attacks on important German industrial and military targets. But the weather prevents you from carrying out these raids at the frequency you need to impact the German war effort. What do? If your answer is to throw all that out the window and begin to send out single bombers that will hide from German fighters in flak by flying in the clouds and conduct non-visual attacks against German targets, then well done. You came up with the same solution the 8th Air Force did. Yes, in the winter of 1942, moling raids were officially adopted by the 8th Air Force as a means of exerting pressure on the Germans when the weather was not suitable for daylight precision bombing raids, which was like 80% of the time at this time. If you've read a lot about the 8th Air Force and have never heard of moling raids before, that isn't surprising. There is next to nothing written about them from what I've been able to find online and in books. There is probably a reason for that. As I've already said, the idea behind moling raids was that individual US heavy bombers would be dispatched on days when thick cloud was forecasted, flying within or just above the thick overcast clouds to and from the designated target to avoid German fighters in flak. Now, in order to navigate accurately while being unable to see the ground, these bombers would have G-sets installed, a radio navigation device developed by the British in 1942 to help their bombers navigate accurately at night. What is noteworthy about these raids, besides the fact the entire concept seems completely at odds with how US heavy bombers were supposed to be used, is the fact the field orders for these raids are very clear that the bombing will not be done visually. After all, a bomber that can see its target can also be seen, and any lone US bomber flying a straight and level bomb run in the open skies would be exceedingly vulnerable to flak or any prowling German fighters. But that raises the question, if you can't see the target, how can you bomb it accurately? There's nothing in the US sources I have that answers this, but the evidence suggests the bombing would be done using G-fixes. This is supported by the presence of G-coordinates in the field orders listing city centers, and a website post by the American Air Museum in England saying that moling raids were blind bombing raids using G. Now, trying to use G for blind bombing wasn't a novel idea. The British Air Ministry pressured Arthur
the Dresden Decimator Harris,
Commander-in-Chief of RAF Bomber Command, to try to use G as a blind bombing or pathfinder marking tool, even though it was never designed to be used as such. And throughout 1942, Bomber Command duly proved that G, was completely unsuitable for blind bombing by failing most of the time to hit anything, even though that anything was supposed to be an entire German city. Harris rapidly concluded G would not work as a blind bombing aid for area bombing, but lacking anything else, he soldiered on with it until better electronic aids became available. And this all makes the 8th Air Force's apparent decision to blind bomb using G just a bit eyebrow-raising. It seems incredibly unlikely that the unsuitability of G as a blind bombing device was not communicated to the 8th Air Force by RAF Bomber Command. Ira Eaker and Arthur Harris had a close professional relationship during this period, and it's hard to believe that Harris did not communicate his own force's experience with G to Eaker. Indeed, we have evidence that the 8th Air Force knew about G's weakness in February 1943, during which moling raids were still ongoing. What is more likely is that the practical accuracy of G didn't matter. The purpose of these raids wasn't to bomb accurately, but to harass the Germans in between major American raids. It was enough for the bombs to fall in or around an industrial town, since that would force the Germans to seek shelter in bomb shelters and interrupt war production as a result. The bombing by US bombers would also force a response from the German defenses, forcing fighters to take off in bad weather where operational accidents would be more likely, and keeping the flak defenses pinned throughout the area of operation to respond to any American moling raids. And while this is all completely logical, it's very clear this kind of blind bombing would be a form of area bombing, even if just on a small scale. As we can see, less than a third of a year into the American daylight bombing effort, and American Air Force commanders were already beginning to compromise on their commitment to visual precision bombing of military and industrial targets due to operational realities. This was, in fact, just the start. In the ultimate irony, however, these moling raids, which came into existence because European weather was unsuitable for daylight precision bombing raids much of the time, were abandoned because typical European weather was unsuitable for moling raids much of the time. You see, these raids required almost continuous cloud cover to and from the target so that the lone American bombers could hide in it, but this was often as rare as days when clear weather was present all the way to and from the target. From what I can tell, it looks like only a handful of moling raids were attempted by the 8th Air Force in early 1943, and in almost all cases, the American bombers encountered clear skies in the target area and aborted their mission as a result. It looks like the moling raids were essentially discontinued by April 1943, which probably accounts for why there's so little written about them in the literature on the 8th Air Force. Imagine you're the lead bombardier in an American combat box, flying in the hostile skies over Germany. The primary target you have been assigned is covered by clouds and cannot be bombed accurately. You fly your box to the secondary target, just to find it's also covered by cloud and cannot be bombed. Your fuel is getting low. You've been under constant attack by flak and fighters, and your formation has suffered losses. You check your orders, and your last resort target is any industrial target of opportunity in the area. Do you A. Fly your combat box all around the hostile skies of Germany, prolonging the time your formation is under threat from fighters in flak, all the while trying to spot an industrial target from 25,000 feet in the sky through any break in the clouds you could find? Or B. Bomb the first German town or village you see and get the hell out of Dodge before your formation suffers any more losses? If you're still not sure, then you must have not paid attention to the title of this video. B. The answer is B. Welcome to 8th Air Force bombing raids over Germany from January to September 1943. Primary and, normally, secondary targets are of a military and industrial nature, but if the conditions prevent either from being bombed, then as a last resort, any built-up area within Germany is fair game. Of course, this is not spelled out as such in the field orders issued for these raids. Officially, last resort targets were to be any industrial targets of opportunity.
The last resort will be any industrial target of importance in Germany.
Okay.
The idea behind this vague description seems to have been that the lead bombardier of a combat box could, on their own initiative, seek out a last resort target if bad weather prevented the primary or secondary targets from being located. And of course, this was supposed to be an industrial target. But as you go through the details of the reports to see what was actually bombed during these last resort bombing raids, it becomes clear that the bar for what constituted an industrial target of opportunity was, a bit low. The post-raid reports suggest American bomber crews routinely picked German city areas or towns and villages as their industrial targets of opportunity, and 8th Air Force commanders do not seem to have had any problems with this. In fact, having gone through a number of the earlier field orders, there is evidence that any industrial target of opportunity was always intended to include built-up areas as possible targets. In the history books, the first American bombing raid on German territory was the January 27, 1943 raid on Wilhelmshaven. Yet, had the European weather not gotten in the way, the first American raid on Germany would have been on December 25, 1942, with the bombing raid on Wiegesach. Listed as the last resort target is the familiar any industrial target of opportunity, but with a twist. Any populated or industrial area in this section of Germany. Subsequent field orders eliminated the populated part from this descriptor for unknown reasons, but reading through subsequent raid reports where the last resort targets were bombed, it's difficult not to conclude that this was merely a visual change, and that it was widely understood among 8th Air Force commanders and crews that bombing built-up areas was allowed as a last resort. For example, the second American air raid on Germany on February 4th, 1943, saw both the primary and secondary targets obscured by clouds. As a result, and for the first time, an attack on an industrial target of opportunity occurred. And, well, secondary and last resort targets were industrial targets in the area. The target attacked was Emden, an industrial town in Germany. The mission narrative gives more detail. Neither primary or secondary target could be bombed. Search was made for a last resort target, and Emden was finally bombed by two groups after a very unsatisfactory run. One group despaired of even finding a last resort and dropped the bombs on the name of some town I can't read. The other groups brought their bombs back. Photographs taken identify the target, but show no results. Verbal reports indicate that the target may have been hit, but the bomb run was only 30 or 40 seconds. Consequently, favorable results are doubtful. As you might have noticed, the reports merely list Emden as a target, not anything inside it. This is not because the reports forgot to mention what targets inside Emden were bombed, it's because no one knew what besides Emden was bombed. Even the American officer who drew up the bomb plotting map had no clue. He simply just decided to select the docks as the aiming point so he had a center point for his map. The mission narrative also mentions that the bomb run was unsatisfactory, which is a way of saying that the bombs probably did not land where they were aimed at with the bombsight. The bomb group reports are also worth mentioning. From the 91st Bomb Group, 1010 clouds were found at the target, and Emden was attacked through 810. Results could not be observed. Remarks: bombs into town, but results unobserved. Bombing results: hits in town and port area. There clearly was no going around a second time to avoid that school across the street.
We're going around again. I know you want to drop the bombs and get the hell out of here, but there's civilians down there. There's a school right next door, and if we don't drop these bombs right in the pickle barrel, there's going to be a lot of innocent people killed.
Clearly, the standards for bombing a last resort target were not particularly high on this raid, and the goal on February 4th seems to have been just getting the bomb somewhere within the city limits of Emden. The fact the lead bombardier felt this was acceptable, and the lack of any evidence suggesting a reprimand from above for what was in essence an area bombing raid on Emden, all suggest that this attack fulfilled the actual intentions of bombing an industrial target of opportunity, as far as it was understood in the 8th Air Force at the time. Subsequent raid reports reinforce this. On June 11, 1943, bad weather and a smokescreen over the primary targets caused several bomb groups to seek out industrial targets of opportunity in the area. The German town of Cuxhaven was bombed by the 94th and 401st Bomb Groups, seemingly due to it having a docks and a rail yard. The rail yard and a pier were hit, but most of the bombs fell into the residential areas. The 301st Bomb Group made a bomb run on Wilhelmshaven, but part of the bomb group failed to bomb, and rather than leave the protection of the combat box, the rest made a bombing run on a small town on the way out of Germany. According to the 351st Bomb Group reports, this town was probably Ulrich. Two of the 91st Bomb Group squadrons record attacking targets of opportunity. Apparently the crews abandoned the pretense that there was anything industrial about these targets of opportunity despite the wording in the field orders. Bombing results: bombs dropped on targets of opportunity due to poor visibility. Bombs were dropped ineffectively on scattered targets of opportunity in northern Germany. And the 401st Squadron just flat out lists the towns that got bombed. Results of bombing are questionable, and reports on targets bombed varied, including such targets as Wilhelmshaven, Aurich, Waterloo, Tuorf, and Hogwa. On June 25th, 1943, a major raid was launched against Hamburg, which ended up becoming something of a complete and utter debacle due to unexpected total cloud coverage and very heavy German fighter activity by what the Americans estimated to be 125 German fighters, with the primary and secondary targets completely covered by extreme undercasts. As one report described it, the crews began to bomb targets of opportunity. How'd that go, I hear you asking? Well, the bombing raid report states that the lead American bombardier of one formation managed to find a hole in the clouds and bombed the town, which was probably Oldenburg. Apparently, and not for the first time, the American crews were not sure what built-up area in Germany they had bombed,
hitting strategic targets with unparalleled precision.
The report continues, the majority of bombs were scattered indiscriminately over Germany and the general vicinity of a whole bunch of German towns. The 305th dropped our bombs on smoke pots in the vicinity of Emden. Some of the bomb group reports are really worth reading. This mission was all FU. 10-10 clouds, solid. Crews claimed a variety of targets bombed, including Orschena, Friedrichskoog, Papenburg, and an enemy convoy. Most crews admitted they didn't know where the hell they dropped them. The 351st Bomb Group mission report is perhaps the clearest example of American staff saying the quiet part out loud in regards to targets of opportunity. Upon finding the entire area undercast, it was decided to bomb the target of opportunity. After a lengthy search, a small unidentified city was located. An initial point was assimilated and the bombing approach began. The aiming point was sighted at 20 degrees to the left. After the completion of the turn onto the target, the synchronization was completed under adverse weather conditions in a minimum of time.
We could lose the war if we don't knock out German industry.
It's clear the American bomber crews interpreted targets of opportunity as including any built-up area in Germany, given the targets chosen were often towns or cities that were spotted through gaps in the cloud. The standards of accuracy was often also poor, with reports freely admitting that the bomb runs were too short to allow for the Norden bombsight to work effectively. It's also notable that the phrase, any industrial targets of opportunity in the area, are not present in field orders for raids on targets in occupied France, Belgium, or the Netherlands, places where it was politically unacceptable to deliberately kill or wound French, Belgium, and Dutch civilians. This again suggests that it was understood in the 8th Air Force that industrial targets of opportunity were little more than a carte blanche to allow American bombardiers to deposit their bombs in any built-up area if the primary and secondary targets were obscured. Occasionally, last resort targets are specified, but some information in the report suggests these targets were city centers. As alluded to earlier in this video, on January 27, 1943, the first American bombing raid on Germany occurred, with around 100 B-17s and B-24s attacking dry docks at Wilhelmshaven and U-boat yards in northern Germany. If weather conditions or smoke screens obscured the targets, the bombers were assigned a last resort target in Emden. Field Order 95 lists this as an aiming point, but the ORS day report suggests what these coordinates actually were for. The last resort targets for all group was Emden, the specific aiming point being the center of the city. 2 B-17s of the 91st group attacked the last resort target. Something notable about this is that on the March 22nd raid by the 8th Air Force, we see a familiar set of coordinates, but this time for the secondary target. This aiming point is in fact the last resort target from the January 27th raid, which, as the operational research report stated, was the city center of Emden. Notably, the March 22nd operational research report merely lists the secondary target as the city of Emden. And this points to another interesting fact, that occasionally the secondary targets appear to have allowed for the bombing of German city centers. The field orders for the American raid on June 13th is unusually clear in its language. In case of poor visibility, bomb center of town. Unfortunately, without having copies of the American maps used that show the targets, it's difficult to know how widespread it was for secondary targets to be built-up areas, as they all use these coordinate codes, which I have no ability to decipher. All that said, it's important not to mischaracterize American raids during this period as being one where random German towns and cities were often bombed due to bad weather. Most raids the 8th Air Force launched during this period saw the primary and/or secondary targets located and bombed, Accuracy was not always good due to technical issues or strong German opposition, but most raids look to have seen American bombers attempt to carry out daylight precision bombing. What is clear, however, is that area bombing of German city centers or outlying towns and villages seemed to have been acceptable as a last resort if the primary or secondary targets were obscured. I've not found any documentation to explain this seeming unofficial area bombing policy. However, it is my opinion that the American Air Force commanders saw area bombing as preferable to American bombers returning to bases with their bombs. Given the cost in money, time, resources, and the losses of aircraft and men entailed in launching bombing raids against Germany, bombing built-up areas was probably seen as more profitable to the war effort rather than bringing the bombs back to base. After all, the Germans would have to use their limited resources to repair utilities, rescue survivors, and rehouse the bombed-out Germans in these towns and cities, and that was something at least. We had won a major victory, for we would bomb in accordance with American principles, using the methods for which our planes were designed. During and after the war, American air commanders devoted considerable effort to defining the legacy of the 8th Air Force in England, portraying the American bombing campaign there as a precision bombing campaign that targeted German military and industrial targets. However, as demonstrated in this video, within months of the start of the 8th Air Force's bomber offensive, American bombers were already engaged in area attacks on German towns and cities on a limited scale. Though 8th Air Force commanders may have wanted to bomb German war industry, the realities of operating over Europe with its uncooperative weather and fierce resistance from the Luftwaffe caused the American commanders to adopt area bombing on a limited scale. German cities and civilians have been deliberately targeted by American bombers, and with this line now crossed, the door was open to an expansion of area bombing attacks on German cities should the circumstances demand it. And this is exactly what happened. On September 27, 1943, 300 B-17s of the 8th Air Force were dispatched to Emden, home to U-boat yards and dock facilities supporting Nazi Germany's submarine force. Once again, American bombers encountered thick cloud blanketing the target, but this time they were prepared. American Pathfinder bombers equipped with British H-2S ground mapping radar sets could see the shape of Emden below them on their radar screens. Starting at 1000 hours, the first American Pathfinder bomber released its ordnance into the thick cloud below, followed by the bomb loads of the other American bombers who bombed on the Pathfinder's command. Radar bombing had begun. No longer would weather dictate the operational tempo of the 8th Air Force. Now American commanders could send their bombers out on days when visual bombing was impossible. But this first-generation radar, while being able to detect German cities, could not identify industry within the city. H-2S radar was not a precision blind bombing device, and American commanders knew it. The targets for radar bombing would therefore be entire German cities. Thus it was, in the fall and winter of 1943, when only 2 or 3 days per month were expected to be suitable for visual bombing, radar bombing would become the dominant means by with which the 8th Air Force would attack Germany. America's first sustained bombing campaign against German cities had begun. But this is the story for another video.